joining us today is Ryan Muldoon, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the University of Buffalo. Before introducing Ryan, I'd just like to thank the groups and organizations that have made this talk and all the things that we do here at UNO possible. It includes the John Templeton Foundation, the Charles Koch Foundation, Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University, the UNO Department of Philosophy, and the UNO Student Government. All of them have contributed a great deal to what we're able to do, and we wouldn't be able to do that without their support. So Ryan Muldoon, again, is an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Buffalo. Previously, he was a senior research fellow in the philosophy, politics, and economics program at the University of Pennsylvania, and a postdoctoral fellow of science and values at the Rotman Institute of Philosophy at the University of Western Ontario. He's the author of numerous articles in moral and political philosophy, and is also the author of the forthcoming manuscript, Beyond Tolerance, Social Contract Theory for a Diverse World. His primary research investigates how we can turn the challenges of increasing diversity into a resource to be tapped for our mutual benefit. Specifically, he investigates how diversity can lead to more just societies, to an increase in the amount and quality of scientific production, and to greater wealth. Today, he is here to talk with us about equality of opportunity, meritocracy, and social cohesion, and why, if we're interested in pursuing those values, we may be only able to achieve two of the three. Please join me in welcoming Ryan Muldoon.
Thanks very much. Thanks so much for having me. So I'm going to argue today that we have three basic liberal values that we tend to want to endorse: meritocracy, equality of opportunity, and social cohesion. I'm going to argue that these are incompatible values, and I'm going to look at why that's the case and how should we go about resolving this issue. So I'll briefly open by saying something about the larger project that this piece is a part of. And then we'll step through these three basic liberal desiderata. So why do we want meritocracy? Why do we want equality of opportunity? Why do we want social cohesion? And then I'll explain how these things conflict with each other, and I'll suggest a way of resolving this tension. So the larger project here is trying to think about why diversity is necessary for the proper achievement of lots of democratic aims. So usually the way we think about democracy is it's the solution to the problem of diversity. If we have democratic institutions and a broad democratic base, we can have social tools for resolving differences generated by diversity. I'm not going to disagree with that, but what I want to say is a lot of the solutions come from diversity itself. So a lot of what makes democracy work is that we have lots of divergent interests and understandings and beliefs. So just other pieces of the puzzle that I've been working on. So in some other work, I've argued that if we look at the way in which we can understand the notion of fairness, it's actually good that we disagree. We're more able on any grounds of fairness to get more of what we want out of an account of fairness if we have opposing views of fairness in the population. I've also looked at the idea of perspectival diversity can prevent some things that we might not like from a policy standpoint, like Schelling-style segregation. And then here I'm interested in the idea that diversity actually can save meritocracy from itself in a certain sense. And then I'm very interested in, and I'll hint at the end here, how diversity has an important role in developing democratic agency. So here are the basic three desiderata. Well, we have a reason to like meritocracy, right? Merit ought to determine the distribution of rewards, whether it's resources or prestige or office. We like equality of opportunity. We like the idea that everyone is starting from an equal position and has equal chances of achieving certain things, at least based on their effort or something like this. And then finally, we have reasons to want to support something that looks like social cohesion. Namely, we want to promote some notion of common aims. We want shared commitments. We want shared values. This seems to be part of what it is to be together in a society. So I'll step through these three desiderata, say why there's reasons that we want them, and then I'll describe why there's a tension. So first we'll start with meritocracy. And basically everybody in the liberal tradition endorses some version of a meritocracy. They tend to think that it's either from a reason of efficiency. It's just a good idea if we're looking to kind of maximize social production of whatever we're talking about, to give it to the people that are most able to do it. So provide extra inputs to the people that are really high producers, whether that's really good at politics or really good in business or whatever it might be. And then we all benefit from that social surplus that is generated by those people that are most able to convert inputs into more output. But then there's also arguments stemming from a desert point of view, namely the people that are better at their jobs, in whatever sense, have earned more resources. They've earned the fact that they should get more because they demonstrated their value to the rest of us. And so meritocracy's value is pretty self-evident on these sorts of accounts. There are good social reasons to want to promote this stuff, right? When we fail to distribute resources, at least roughly according to merit, we're kind of squandering some of those resources. When we fail to recognize people are incentivized by getting differential benefit, that can cause us to not produce as much as we could. So this ties into the notion of kind of efficiency first. So we might think that meritocracy is good just because it's a good way of allocating resources. We get more stuff in the end if we make sure that our inputs to production, whatever that production might be, goes to the people that are most able to create outputs. And so we worry about productive capacity. There's only so much stuff that we have to distribute. So we want to make sure we're getting as much as we can. And so if we give it to people that are able to produce more, we get more in the end. And this works even if our concern is for the well-being of the less meritorious, the people that are less productive or whatever it might be. If we just want to have more stuff to distribute, it's still smart to allocate stuff initially to the people that can make more. So this just follows John Stuart Mill's distinction between allocation and distribution. We can allocate stuff to the meritorious, and then we can redistribute it as we see fit according to whatever system of justice that we want to endorse. But then there's usually a totally related notion here that meritocracy and desert just go together. So not only is there allocational efficiency that we want to track, but also there's an element of justice with meritocracy. We just should be giving stuff to people that have earned it, right? They've done more stuff, and we fail to treat them equally if we don't recognize this. This is going back to Aristotle and his account of what equality means is just equality is proportion. If you don't recognize that some people are better at something and don't give them resources according to how much better they are, you're failing to treat them with respect. They've earned this stuff, we should give it to them. So that's another way that broadly liberal accounts can have a reason to want to support something like meritocracy. But then we have this other desiderata, something like equality of opportunity. We have a kind of background idea that, well, people should have, roughly equivalent starting chances in life, roughly equivalent ability to kind of achieve their goals. They don't guarantee that they get those goals, but they have some ability to it, and perhaps it's just tracked by how much effort they put in or how good they are. But it shouldn't be just because of your initial social position that determines the outcome. And in general, liberal theorists at least endorse a principle like this. And the difference across liberal theorists is just how strong of an initial principle do they want to set up. So they want to just make it so there's no formal barriers to entry to office, or there are no kind of legal reasons by which you can't participate in certain markets or political goods. Or they can think that we have to distribute resources in a way that enables people to actually get the kind of real value of that opportunity. We have to ensure that people have something like an equal chances kind of model. But in the background here, this is playing a really important justificatory role in democracy, or just liberal theory in general. Because in any sort of account where we have differential rewards, and it's not just strict egalitarianism, the idea goes, well, we have to be able to justify to the distributional losers why they lost, and why the people that have more stuff should get the more stuff. And so if you start out having no opportunity to reap rewards, why would you support a system where you just don't get anything? So if you want any kind of count of political stability, you need some way of explaining to people that if they end up not as successful as they wanted to be, there are structural reasons for why they could have achieved something else. If there's no way they could have ever done that, then they have no reason to endorse the system. And so equality of opportunity just is kind of trying to ensure the well-functioning of a system, maintain its stability, be able to justify to people that lose out that it could have been otherwise. And there is a difference here about whether we think this is a purely formal account of just not legally blocking people from political office or something like that, but or we have to provide sort of a stronger right to this equality, whether that includes providing resources to people to achieve those sorts of goals. But in general, even a bare account of this has something like this in the background as an argument of just for stability reasons, we want something like this to justify to ourselves why we end up with certain outcomes. We need something like this principle. So to think more about that, it's just if we don't have this equality of opportunity, the game is just rigged, right? If we have a system where it's just called Muldoon wins, and I get all of the stuff, why would any of you endorse that plan, right? You don't have equal opportunity to any of those opportunities. I would just automatically get them. And so for that reason, you would just reject it, right? You would reject any outcomes that are based on something that was just a rigged system. And so if we have something that looks like equality of opportunity, we can block that criticism. We can say, no, you had the opportunity. It might have just not worked out in your favor this time. But this doesn't suggest that there's a structural factor keeping you away from whether it's economic success or political success or whatever it might be. And so this stabilizes the system. It allows us to endorse outcomes that are not favorable to us. But we can think about how strong of a principle we want this to be. So luck egalitarians want to go really far and say, well, it's not just we have to worry about your initial economic situation, but your intelligence, your skill, even your willingness to work hard, that might not be up to you if we have a very strong account of the things that are up to you and not up to you. And so that suggests a very broadly distributional principle. People that are more kind of classically liberal might want to constrain that to purely formal kind of consideration. So your effort is just the important thing. And so we can think about what are the reasonable bases for assessing the merit that you need to have to justify equality of opportunity. But pretty much everyone needs some sort of account of this. On what basis do we have an equal starting position such that we could do something else? So this final value that we want to look at is just the notion of cohesion. To think about what it is to be a political unit suggests that we have some kind of connection to each other that involves shared values, shared commitments, shared aims. And so there's lots of different accounts of social cohesion. I think these three basic ideas are pretty core to a lot of them. And we find outside of philosophy, if we look in the sociology literature, there's a notion of what's called bonding capital. And so bonding capital, this is Robert Putnam and a lot of his followers, have an idea of, well, when we're more similar in the notion of these aims that we have, these values that we have, these commitments that we share, the better functioning that community is. The more likely we're to help each other out. The easier it is for us to resolve disputes. The more we are able to kind of set our goals for ourselves and achieve a fair amount of stability. We're just not going to argue as much if we have these sort of shared commitments with each other. And so one of the things that social cohesion is supposed to provide to us very often, especially in this kind of bonding capital literature, is what it means to be meritorious. So how we cash out the concept of who is better at X than who comes from these shared commitments and values. So what's the stuff that we value as society, and what's the kind of skills or individual qualities that helps us get that stuff, right? So we can imagine an account of merit that's just based on, your juggling ability. And we just want to plow resources to really good jugglers. That's one way of going. Or we could think, well, the most important thing is how able are you to generate wealth, right? That's another thing we could care about. Or we could care about how able are we to, assist others. And so like the maximally altruist kind of people are the ones that have the most merit. right? All of these are different ways of thinking about what merit means, but a cohesive society has picked. They've decided on what merit is, and cohesion provides us with a standard account of what that looks like, so we're not disagreeing about what merit means. And this ties in really importantly to just a notion of political community. And this is just because, well, when we think about what it is to be, an American, what we think it is to be in Louisiana, or whatever it might be, part of that is you're going to list off some kind of shared values, some shared conception of what it is to be a citizen of this place, what it is to kind of participate in a system of social cooperation with others. And those are going to stem from kind of those values and commitments, what we're like. How is our community organized? What are the things that we care about? All of those are going to structure the notion of what political community looks like for us. And that just comes from these shared values. And if we look in the empirical literature, if we flesh this out in terms of this notion of bonding capital that Putnam has, it's just highly correlated with all kinds of indicators that we generally like. So lower crime rates, longevity and lifespan, fewer disputes, much less violence of all kinds, easier time with things like trust and basically all the nice things that we can think of tend to go up with more bonding capital. But the trouble here is that all of these independently seem like nice things. They're all stuff that we have reasons that we want to endorse. But the trouble is, there seems to be a trilemma between the three. That is, we can't have all three at once. We have to give up on one of them. Because I'm going to argue that meritocracy and social cohesion combine to kill off equality of opportunity. If we're a very cohesive society insofar as we agree on what merit consists in, it makes it very hard for us to achieve any account of equality of opportunity that we might want. And so we can have any pair of these values that we might want, but having all three is just not going to work, because we're ultimately not be able to achieve equality of opportunity. So why is this? So there's something called the Matthew effect that I think is quite important. So the kind of catchphrase for the Matthew effect is just the rich get richer. And we can formally describe this by relying on what's called a preferential attachment model. And I'll show you an example of that in a minute. But the basic idea of a preferential attachment process or a Matthew process is just that resources are distributed according to the current distribution of resources. So past success enables future success. And this process generates what's called the power law distribution of resources over time. So it looks very different from how we normally conceive of what's going on, and I'll show you why this matters. So here's a little video of a preferential attachment process, and what you'll notice what's going on here is it's just going to be little nodes connecting to each other on a graph. And the decision rule that's generating this graph is just the person I want to connect to is correlated with, the probability of it is how many people they're already connected to. So think about it in this way. Who do you want to be friends with, assuming it is sort of costly to build up a friendship? You probably are more likely to want to be friends with people that already have a lot of friends. So they introduce you to a whole bunch of people. And so the value of that friendship is just higher. And so given two options, you can be friends with a loner or someone that's really well liked. It's probably better for you to choose the person that's really well liked, because that opens a lot of doors for you. And so if it costs something for you to make these connections, you go that way. So here's a quick little demonstration of what that looks like. So we're just adding a person through time, and they have a probability distribution over who they pick, and they're just more likely to pick the people that are already connected to a lot of people. So what you'll notice is that this is happening. The big circles that have lots of connections just get bigger and bigger and bigger. That should be sufficient to get the idea. So this big blue guy, or this big guy right here, just gets larger and larger and larger. And the only reason that happens is because in the previous round, he had more connections. What's important here is that it's not that there's any account of who would make a better friend or anything like that. It's just random initial conditions. Whoever kind of started out first tends to win. And this is important if we think that merit operates something like this, and I'll give us some reasons to think that. Because typically we think of something that looks more like a random distribution. We're talking about the distribution of resources in a population. Maybe a few people are have a lot of connections, and then we dip down, and most people are somewhere in the middle. So most people have a few connections, and there's very few on either side. But if it's power law distribution, almost all of the connections are held by just a couple people, and pretty much everyone else has very few. And so this skews pretty strongly what's going on with the distribution of resources. Because if we want to make resources match merit, we might think that there might be a slightly more of a linear relationship. But this suggests a very not linear relationship. It's pulling very strongly on a couple people, and everyone else, you can't even make very fine distinctions in terms of distribution of resources to the merit that we're trying to track. What's worse here is that social cohesion makes this process more likely in all kinds of areas. The more we have social cohesion and meritocracy combining, the more often we'll get Matthew effect kinds of cases in all sorts of areas of life. When we have these shared aims and we have these shared accounts of merit, it's very easy to rely on the judgments of others to generate your next judgment. So we'll talk through a couple examples of this that I find kind of interesting. So there's a quite interesting empirical study about soccer players. If you look at professional soccer players, it's curious that most of them are born in the first few months of the year. This is a weird puzzle. So initially people were thinking, well, maybe if we look kind of 9 months before those birthdays, there's major soccer tournaments. So maybe if your parents are really excited about soccer, you come about and they encourage you to play soccer and things like that. That doesn't work. They tried all these different hypotheses. The thing that seems to stick is youth soccer. So think about youth soccer when you first start playing when you're around 5. If you're born in January, you're actually significantly older than someone that was born in October. And at that age, that means you're a bit more coordinated, you're a bit bigger, you're going to be a bit able to throw yourself around on the field. You're more likely to be able to kick a ball in a straight line. You're just more you have those more basic skills more firmly in place just by being a few months older. So what happens because of that initial difference, even if it's fairly small? Well, you're a bit more likely to get the ball. The coach is a bit more likely to spend time with you. You're going to enjoy it more because you're better at it than everyone else. So you're going to probably work a little harder. And so that just keeps accumulating because the more time you get the ball, the more practice you get. The more time the coach spends with you, the more likely your skills will improve. The more you like it because you're better, the more you're going to invest effort into it. And so this just pulls apart. So these quite small initial differences that would be otherwise fully surmountable, right? It's not a real big skills difference between January people and October people. But it starts off this process of kind of cumulative advantage. This is also true of citation patterns in academia. So if you look at how people cite other people's papers, if you are an early mover in a paper in a subfield, someone might cite you. And the more your paper is cited, the more important it is to cite that paper in the future. Because if a person's refereeing a paper and saying, well, why aren't you citing Muldoon on this? Because everyone else has been doing it, and so it's important. But that just accumulates more and more citations. not because it's kind of being discovered that it's a better and better paper, but rather just the previous practice of citation encourages more citation. We talked a little bit about friendship. This works for professional networking in the same kind of way. If you're looking to develop a professional network, it's smart for you to go to the people that have more professional connections. That person is more valuable to you than someone that only has a few connections because they open more doors for you. But that means that those people will pile on more and more and more professional connections on the fact that they had the ones before. So these might be a little abstract. You can think also about just how this works with commerce. So think about when you shop on Amazon or something like that. Amazon very conveniently lists on the side what the top selling products are. When you see the list of the top selling products, you're a bit more likely to click on those things and think about buying those versus the many alternatives that you could buy for the same product category. But when you do that, it's the past sales success that drives the future sales. It might not be an underlying difference in quality. It could be that for some fluke, one thing sold 5 more today than some other thing, but it moved it up in the top sellers list. And so that makes it easier for you to buy more and more of those. Similarly, if you think about something like the New York Times bestseller list for books, right? If you're on the bestseller list, people think, oh, well, now I need to read it because everyone's talking about that book. And so I buy it, then it stays on the bestseller list for longer. And then it becomes even more important that everyone to have read it because now it's part of the conversation. But these could be very marginal differences. Who was, the last on the list versus the next book? That makes a big sales difference. Likewise, if you show up in the top listings of Amazon books, that's a big deal, right? That drives way more sales. And you might think this is only kind of fancy internet technology that's doing this, but if you think about how grocery stores work, or if you walk into Walmart, what happens? Walmart very carefully decides where it puts things on the shelves for you to buy. The stuff that's kind of eye level, mid-shelf, that's most likely the stuff that people purchase. So Walmart moves the stuff that's selling the best to that shelf. The product doesn't become better, but it drives up sales more because now it's a more accessible place that people notice more. And that decision was based on the fact that it was selling better before. And so all of these processes just encourage more winning from past winners. And the thing about this is none of this is bad. Each of these is perfectly fine decisions. Amazon and Walmart want to make money, so they want to make the best-selling stuff easy for you to find because they think that's the stuff that people want. Likewise, it's not bad to pass the ball to the kid that's better at soccer. That's kind of a sensible strategy. In the same way that it just is smart from a professional networking point of view to go towards the people that have more connections for you to be able to take advantage of yourself. It's a good investment of your resources. But all these things put together create a very strange phenomenon where kind of initial slight advantage turns into outsized advantage over time. And what's going on in particular is that this does imply an overuse of evidence. So my judgment of what's good is based on your judgment of what's good, which is based on someone else's judgment of what's good, and back and back and back. So that original adjustment of what was good is now used 20 times instead of just once. Because built into our judgments is all the previous judgments that took place if we're relying on the fact that other people seem to like this. And so this can have fairly serious effects in all kinds of areas of life. So one example of this is something looking at verbal achievement amongst young children. So there's a very large difference in just the number of words you know, depending on your socioeconomic background of your parents. So if you're born into a family on social assistance, you know less than half the number of words of children born in professional families by the time you're 3 years old. And this piles on for the rest of your life. Why is this happening? Well, It's just a bit more likely that children in professional families are encountering more words as their parents are speaking. There's more books around. There's more communication from parents typically because they have a bit more leisure time to spend with their parents than other scenarios often. And so as you learn more words, it's easier for you to learn more. Right? You can follow more conversations if you have an initial vocabulary that supports understanding. If you lack that initial vocabulary, it's less fun for you to engage in word games or have books read to you because you just don't understand it, so it's frustrating. But if you know those words, then it's fun, and it gives you reason to want to learn more words. So it's the same as the soccer sort of story, right? It's just you try harder if you feel like you're succeeding. You're less likely to try if you feel frustrated. And so we get quite pronounced differences from very small initial differences. And the idea here is these kinds of distributions undermine equality of opportunity. If you have a preferential attachment process that's underway, it's very hard to have kind of linear accounts of merit and reward. And so only the really strict accounts of formal equality of opportunity will be satisfied here. Only the no legal restriction kind of classical liberal model, and that's it. Because if you think about some of these processes, even if you're a brand new entrant that's of very high quality, it's very hard for you to enter into a system that already has this distribution underway. Think about something like professional networking. If you're coming into the game late, it's very unlikely that you're going to amass lots and lots of connections, even if you're a great people person. Because why will people invest in a network relation with you versus someone that already has an established set of links? Likewise with anything else. And so new entrants and even above average existing agents are all going to be kind of mathematically negligible access to median or mean accounts of resources. So even if you're kind of like a run-of-the-mill, like a middle-of-the-road guy, you're going to be, on average, below average. Because a power law distribution means that you can't be average with average rewards. If you're average, you're getting minimal rewards. Only kind of the superstar on one end, or the very small number of superstars, are going to get rewards, but they're going to be far outstripping their level of actual quality on merit. And so we're distributing resources by merit, but even if I have a pretty big distinction with the next guy in the line, we're going to be quite close if we're sort of at the lower end of the power law distribution. But as we move up the power law distribution, those initial differences could have been very small, but generate massive differences. And what's important here is that it's not proportionate distribution of rewards anymore by any stretch. There might be the same rank ordering if we're lucky, but not at all proportional to quality. Instead, we just have a very small number of agents who get virtually everything, and everybody else has very minimal distinctions in reward for everything else. On top of this, this is massively path dependent. That means it really matters what the initial conditions were, who started out, and just the luck of the draw on the initial step. An example of this is, I believe it's Duncan Watts did a really nice study with a bunch of college students where they were asked to rate music. So they were given 10 songs that they had never heard of, and they were asked to give a rank order of the song quality. So which are the best couple songs? And the way they did this was they asked people to kind of post publicly on a little on their computers which song was the best. Virtually always there was very strong agreement about what song was the best. Across groups that did this, there was no correlation which song was picked. Just once a couple people said one song is great, everyone piled onto that. Similarly, if you look at kind of wine competitions for the best bottle of wine, there is zero correlation between winning an award in one competition and winning an award in another competition for the same bottle of wine. Instead, it seems that people pile on to one claim and not, and that process just starts again with a new competition. So we can think about this, we can imagine sort of a fictional academic discipline that's interested in promoting these three desiderata. We can imagine that they want meritocracy, so the best people go to the best places. We want something that looks like equality of opportunity. We want an even starting field. And we want social cohesion. We want to agree on what it is to be a good member of this discipline. So we might want to say, well, to ensure meritocracy, we want to come with a ranking scheme. We can just list who's best or what places are best and kind of maintain that list. But the trouble if we do that, well, things like reputation are backwards looking. Right? If I think someone has a reputation of doing something good, it's because of what they did before, not what they're doing right now. But very typically, your reputation judgments of people are based on other people's judgments of that person's reputation, not kind of you independently assessing. And the more we agree that what criterion we pick and that we agree on each other's judgments, it's easier for us to do that. But what makes this worse is that now departments have reasons to pick people who others agree are very good. And likewise, individuals have reasons to go to places that people have otherwise have agreed are very good. And so what's very odd about this, unlike some of these other circumstances, is that now the initial ranking generates all future rankings. Right? So we're not even tracking relevant differences anymore. We're just kind of following a historical path. And so in this kind of world, equality of opportunity basically has disappeared. We end up with cohesion and meritocracy tracking something, but the kind of rewards for what they're tracking are wildly different from kind of the underlying differences. So in this sort of approach, what I want to argue is the more we agree on stuff like this, just the more social problems we generate. And the entire driver of this phenomenon is that we're agreeing of how to understand what merit consists in. The more we agree, the easier it is to rely on this to generate this preferential attachment result because we're relying on this old evidence. You know, my initial judgment that other people start using just gets counted more and more times rather than only once, the way it's kind of supposed to work. And so we can think about when you receive one award, it's just easier to get the next award. There's been a number of empirical studies looking at the first job you get determining your future salary for kind of the rest of your career. Because all of your salaries are based on your previous salary. It might have been a fluke what your initial salary was. But that initial judgment, whether it was accurate or not, or whatever it might be, carries with you forever. Because every future salary is based on your previous salary. So the trouble is, this just reuses lots of old evidence over and over again. So those first decisions matter way more than the current decisions that we're making. So when we agree with each other's judgments to this extent, we just create the conditions for this preferential attachment process, this Matthew effect, to happen. And so if we want to resolve this problem, if we want to resolve this trilemma, we basically have three options. We can either go with what we can call the merit cohesion strategy, which is just give up on equality of opportunity. And we just embrace the fact that the world is preferential attachment models, and that's fine. So we can say that outside rewards are just a good thing, and we should reward stars quite heavily. That's an approach. Another approach would be embracing both equality of opportunity and social cohesion, where we just say, who cares about meritocracy? Instead, we want to focus on kind of shared aims and equality. That's also a viable option. And that probably pushes us in a direction of kind of egalitarianism or communitarianism. And then finally, we have something like merit equality of opportunity, where we give up on social cohesion. And instead there, we just embrace that lots of people are going to have different kinds of aims, different kinds of commitments, different kinds of values. And we're going to get lots more disagreements than in these previous two cases, because we're just not going to agree about what merit means. And so instead of having kind of one hierarchy in society, we have lots of them. So we can consider each in turn for a moment. If we go with a merit cohesion route, this just turns into a star system. So you can think about something like Hollywood, right? Not huge differences between lots of people's acting ability or their attractiveness or whatever, but only a few people get to win. Likewise, professional sports and things like that. So a few people get really massive rewards that don't track the degree to which they're better than everyone else. And everyone in the middle is not going to be able to really distinguish at all. Someone that's kind of average ability will be treated as someone with below average ability. And for that reason, meritocracy is pretty much lost for everybody else. You might get kind of pennies more than the next guy, but that might be even when you're much, much better and more meritorious than the next guy. So it doesn't seem like we're getting much meritocracy for everybody else. Then we just have these sort of time order problems that we're talking about. If you're a late entrant into a system, it's really hard for you to break through, even if you're really good. And so unless we believe everyone starts out at the same time, this is going to generate some systematic problems. The next kind of option is we can embrace equality of opportunity and social cohesion as the two values that we most want. But if we do that, we're getting rid of meritocracy, and that comes at a pretty real cost. If we take that option, we're pushed to a pretty strong version of egalitarianism pretty fast. We're just going to have to turn equality of opportunity into just equality, because there's not going to be a grounding on which we can have differential rewards very easily. And so I tend to think this isn't a very tenable political position, or at least it's not a tenable political position for large groups, so at like a nation level. This might work for like a kibbutz or a small kind of intentional community. That'd be fine. But as you scale up, it's going to be quickly incompatible with our psychology. It's hard for us to have a reason to work particularly hard if we're not getting any kind of differential rewards. And the last option is getting rid of social cohesion. If we get rid of social cohesion, we keep merit, we keep equality of opportunity, but now it means that we don't all agree on what merit means. And so this is almost certainly going to generate more social tension, which is unsurprising because we just gave up on cohesion. But it also, I think, creates more room for individual agency. It means that we're more likely to kind of endorse an account of merit rather than just be kind of led into an account of merit. So that we can choose amongst options might have some independent moral value for us. So perhaps unsurprisingly, I suggest we go that route. We should abandon social cohesion. So social cohesion is just too costly for us. And the other two are just much more desirable aims. We have a good reason to want meritocracy. We have a good reason to want equality of opportunity. And if we go with merit cohesion, let's suppose that that seems good, we're not even really clearly tracking merit anymore, because only a few people get differential rewards, and they're far outsized compared to the underlying differences in quality. If we go towards cohesion and equality of opportunity, it seems like we're going to have just massive incentive effects in the society, especially if it gets too big. It's just going to be really hard to effectively provide the resources for ourselves that we want. But even if these weren't so bad, and we might want to argue that at least this is a plausible political account, I think it's really hard to justify this one. I would still want to say that the third option is better. And I think the third option is better precisely on these agency kinds of grounds. It's very different to kind of just accept a set of values that your community has always had and you just adopt blindly, versus you feeling like you have some options and the ability to choose which are the values that you actually want to endorse. What are the kinds of commitments that you want to hold? And so if you're in a community that has less social cohesion, there are more opportunities for you to decide the things that you actually endorse. And this allows for kind of more experiments in the way we can possibly live and arrange ourselves. What is it that we actually think merit means? And we can have that as just a larger debate that doesn't really end. And so on this idea, you kind of get to choose a hierarchy that you want to participate in. You choose the thing you want to be judged on by yourself and by others, and you get to ignore the other ones if you don't think that they're important. And this, to me, seems like an important element of what freedom consists in. The ability to kind of decide on what terms you want your life judged, and on what terms you want to be compared to others, and how you want to compare others to each other. So I argue social cohesion and meritocracy just are two great tastes that don't taste great together. They provide preconditions for this preferential attachment kind of process. And because these processes exist, they kill off equality of opportunity. And because they kill off equality of opportunity, we lose important aspects of what meritocracy is doing. And so for this reason, I think we're more or less forced to endorse elimination of social cohesion as a social goal. And instead, we should go towards meritocracy and equality of opportunity. All right. Thanks very much, and I'm very happy to hear your feedback.
Take your own questions. As a reminder, when you have your question, just hit your little touch button on the mic.
Okay, so how would you go about creating the equality of opportunity for the people who are super rich and for the people who are very poor? How do you balance that so that everyone actually does start at the same spot, or like has the ability to achieve the same things if like they're born into inherently different roles?
So just in general, or in this last case that I'm considering?
In general, and then I guess you can go like into more detail, but I just feel
Good.
like that's
so there are a few different ways that you can think about this. So there's a spectrum of answers in political philosophy. One is all equality of opportunity means is just there's no formal restriction on your entry. So you can think about it this way: in the United States, anybody that's old enough can run for president if they were born here, right? No problem. That doesn't mean that anyone can win, right? It's much easier to win the presidency if you're personally rich or have a lot of rich friends that can buy you airtime and things like that. Lots of people, in fact, do run. We just don't hear about them. But in that sense, there's formal equality of opportunity. Anyone can run if they meet those minimal requirements. If we go more in a high liberal direction, then we start being concerned with what's called the real value of the equality of opportunity. So that looks like, what are the resources that we might have to distribute to you to make sure that you're starting out on equal footing? So maybe that means ensuring that our public schools exist and are good enough that you're getting a good education regardless of the educational background of your parents or your socioeconomic status. Other things we might think are important here are kind of easy access to affordable college, or kind of access to lawyers if you need one to defend yourself. These are the sorts of things where we're distributing resources downward in the direction of lower socioeconomic status individuals to ensure that they have a real access to those rights. And so that's an open political debate on which way we should go there to assure equality of opportunity. But what I'm arguing in this context is, if we have these preferential attachment processes, even if you're a pretty stringent, just no formal barriers kind of guy, it's hard to look at that distribution and think there's any initial opening inequality. You can even kind of prove theorems to show that there isn't. So, math can show us that it's basically impossible. And so, to my ears, that sounds like there isn't actually equality of opportunity present. We can solve it in other kinds of ways. So if you have a distributional system, or if we give up on a single account of merit, as I'm suggesting, then there might be some hierarchy on which you can compete. Even if it's, you might not be able to compete on the wealth and income one if you start out very poor, but maybe you can compete on fantastic writer of poetry, or great juggler, or whatever it might be that kind of is the thing that is important to you. The more we kind of spread out what merit means, the less likely that the initial conditions you're starting out with block every path for you.
So I was wondering, with the trilemma, are you thinking of it in terms of, if you wanted, say, to have a strong meritocracy and a strong equality of opportunity, that it's necessary to compromise on social cohesion, or that in order to have, the full two, you have to abolish the third as far as possible, or just that you have to compromise a bit on it?
That's a great question. So I think we're pushed pretty hard down the road of abolishment. You're right that you don't have to go all the way. So you can think about this as like a triple maximization problem. You can't maximize all three. You can probably get away with some social cohesion and a lot more of the other two. But just as you increase social cohesion, the problems get worse. So one way of imagining this, you can think of kind of islands of communities that have kind of internal social cohesion, but you can compete on which island you want to participate in. It's not that every individual has to have their own account of merit, so you're allowed to have some agreement with some people, but the broader that cohesion goes, the more in trouble you get. And so you can think of, it's possible in these little mini islands that you can get a version of this preferential attachment model going the more people agree. So it will happen slower, the smaller that is. And we might be able to think about if the process is slow enough that generational change is fast enough that process just doesn't matter. But the kind of more cohesion you allow, the faster this happens, and the more in trouble you get.
Yeah, thanks. This relates actually to that question, and I think I largely agree with you, so it's probably more clarification than anything. But you said at the end of the talk that we want to get into a community with less social cohesion in order to maximize these other two to the extent that we can. And you also put it as eliminate social cohesion as a goal. I guess I'm wondering about exactly the viability of that, given that meritocracy and equality of opportunity seem to be very clearly things that we can regulate, either through the market, through legislation.
Sure.
A lot of the stuff that leads to social cohesion sounded to be more sort of psychological facts about how we make decisions. So I was wondering, is that, when you say eliminate as a goal, do you mean politically encourage the people to have different accounts of merit or something like that?
That's a great question. So there's a few ways that we can think this through. So one option is, you're right, make sure that institutionally we're not doing things to reinforce particular accounts of meritocracy. That's kind of an easy sort of case. So assuredly we can do that. We can try to make sure that we're not making our problems worse, right? Another kind of approach is, whether we want to think about this as an individual obligation or an obligation of the state, is what can we do to discourage things that sociologists call bonding capital and encourage things that sociologists call bridging capital. So conveniently for my background interest, the more diverse a population you have, the less bonding capital you have. That's a pretty robust finding in the literature. The more people around you are different, the less of that bonding capital is present. But there's plenty of opportunity for bridging kind of capital. And so conveniently, if we think about things like urbanization or immigration and those kinds of processes, those are great at killing bonding capital. And they're pretty good at creating bridging capital. And so those kinds of background policies we can put in place to ensure that this doesn't happen. But also we can just think about, there are already, I think, pretty clear differences across countries on this front. So I've kind of lived a little bit of time in France, and there's a whole lot more social cohesion in France than there is here on a lot of grounds. There's a much clearer overall hierarchy than as president of the United States. So there it's much harder for you to pick the thing you want to care about. The US, we have this to some extent. We can kind of pick, do I want to be judged as an academic? Do you want to be judged as how effectively I can make money, in which case I'm failing pretty dramatically? Or I can think about other ways I might want to be judged, right? How nice my beard looks, whatever it might be, right? And so these are all things that I can kind of pick for myself, and I can more or less easily surround myself with people that either disagree with me or agree with me on these sorts of grounds. And we don't have to have a broad-based agreement about which of those hierarchies is most important. But you're right that there's going to be a limit to the kind of coercive power of the state to enforce something like this. But we can certainly make it no longer a goal for us, right? And we can articulate reasons why we should not try to achieve that. And so even that kind of scales things back enough that we might slow down some of these processes sufficiently that we can recover enough equality of opportunity that we're better off.
Following up on the questions that have already been asked, because I mostly agree with you also, but it seems that all three of these desiderata should instead be talked of as quantities rather than either or.
Good.
And there's probably a point at which social cohesion can decline so much that both meritocracy and equality of opportunity, ironically, become even more difficult to achieve. So I
Do you have a
guess,
case in mind, or?
No, but for example, you were talking about social cohesion and immigration, and in some ways, immigration increases social cohesion because people who strive mightily and go through all kinds of hardships to get here often are more patriotic, more appreciative of things that we take for granted. And so there are trade-offs, I think, that makes this interaction of the three desiderata more complicated, but should be taken into account somehow.
Yeah, you're right. So I think that these aren't kind of binary options. They're going to be on a continuum. We can think about how much cohesion, how much meritocracy, how much equality of opportunity. For sure, we can think of these as kind of scalar values. And so I don't think I lose too much to agree with that. But I am less sure if I can generate a case where if we go below a certain level of social cohesion, the other two are undermined also. The way that might go, you could think, is maybe if I don't agree with anybody in what merit consists in, then it's kind of perhaps a less meaningful kind of term. So if I'm the sole person that wants to defend the idea that one's juggling ability should be determining their presidential outcome or something like that, that's going to be hard for other people to get on board with me, and I'm not going to be able to move resources according to that account. And so, right, so it might be that we want to eliminate the kind of singleton accounts on merit sort of case.
I offer the House Freedom Caucus as an example. They are they're rebelling so much against cohesion within Congress that it's very difficult for any policy to pass. And so you get to the point where there's so little social cohesion that it's impossible to gain sufficient support, a winning coalition in favor of the policies that would increase equality of opportunity and or meritocracy.
So good, but I think that's caused by two things. So first, the House Freedom Caucus is pushing a pretty hard line that they're unwilling to make trade-offs on. But they're only empowered by a rule designed to promote social cohesion, namely the Hastert rule. If you eliminate the social cohesion promoting Hastert rule, you lose that problem altogether, because then the speaker is empowered to make whatever coalition they so choose on whatever bill they want. It's only because people feel kind of by social norms compelled to follow the Hastert rule, which is a made-up rule in the mid-90s, that is not part of any rule, actual rule written down anywhere, the sole purpose of which is to promote party cohesion, then the Freedom Caucus can't do what they're doing. So that's in part driven by a cohesion goal, I think.
The Hastert rule may promote social cohesion within one party,
right,
but it prevents or it destroys cohesion within the House as a whole. So again, trade-offs.
Yeah, no, for sure. The other way I could respond to that is something like the inability to pass any legislation might be precisely the goal of the House Freedom Caucus. Like if you tend to think government legislation leads to larger government and you're kind of against that, there's a pretty good strategy to guarantee your goals. But that's a side issue on kind of how politics goes.
So can you say a bit more in practice what this might look like in terms of the laws or policies that you would pass or that would be passed in order to, say, reduce cohesion in order to benefit the other two values?
So good. So a few things that are, I think, going to pop out of this are localism in politics starts looking a lot better. The more you can push things down to closer to local control, the more opportunities you have for competing accounts of what merit looks like. So the model here is roughly going to be different municipalities or jurisdictions can sort of compete with each other on accounts of merit, and citizens can vote with their feet for which one they like. So this is going to look kind of like that island sort of model of cohesion. Another thing is you can encourage immigration, you can encourage urbanization. It's pretty easy to do that. Where we find the most level of bonding capital is low density environments that are fairly stable environments, namely not a lot of inflows or outflows. So what we can do to encourage more internal mobility and more mobility into the country, which are certainly within the kind of levers of policy control that we have, the more likely we're going to focus on bridging kinds of capital, and the more likely we're going to generate these sorts of things. Then there's also just the kind of social norms element of this, where part of what drives higher levels of social cohesion is that we've decided that it's a good thing that we ought to promote, and we encourage people to adopt particular sets of values and norms. Whereas if we instead push a more kind of tolerance-focused line that allows for lots of different accounts of merit, then informally we can control this quite effectively as well. So a chunk of this can be done with formal policy, but I think a large chunk is under informal institutions as opposed to formal ones. The Hastert rule is not a law, it's something that parties have decided for themselves. And they're enforced purely on social norms. And so the more we can do to encourage kind of open and more tolerant kinds of norms, the more we sound like On Liberty Chapter 3, the better off we are. Where it's kind of, there are formal rules that we can put in place, but a lot of it's going to be kind of informal control. Is that it? Yep.
At the beginning, when you were laying out the three things, it seems like your justification for why equality of opportunity is something that we value is because it conduces to stability. And I'm just wondering, like, what exactly is the difference between stability and cohesion? How do you have one without the other?
That's a great question. So the way I want to pull apart a notion of cohesion and a notion of stability is, so cohesion is just, are we all on the same page in terms of the values that we endorse? And like whether we have an account of what our common aims are. So lots of ways that we can disagree on our values and we can disagree on our aims and not be kind of an unstable situation. Kind of the goal of tools like democracy is to enable us to have different kinds of goals and aims and values, but find a resolution mechanism so we can make public decisions. But if we think about what the stability function of equality of opportunity is doing is say, why do I buy into this rule set at all? So we can have We can either have rules that are designed for a super cohesive community where we say the laws are going to put in place the particular values of this particular moral community. That might suffer from instability if we have people that do not share those values. But if we have a system of laws that's meant to look more in the tolerant direction, that's not based on any particular comprehensive moral doctrine or religion or whatever it might be, then there's plenty of room for us to have different kinds of goals and aims. But the stability concern is purely based on if I lose out, right? If my life doesn't go the way that I wanted it to, what keeps me from having pitchforks and torches in the street, right? If I think that there's just no way that I was going to ever win because the system is rigged against me, why shouldn't I have pitchforks and torches in the street? Because this wasn't designed for me. Like, there's no way that this was going to work. So I'm just being exploited by this system. Equality of opportunity is meant to respond to that, right? It saves us from that kind of worry. You know, things might not have worked out in this instance, but it's not because there's no way that it could have worked out. It's just sometimes you don't win, right? In the same way that you can play a game with someone and sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. You don't throw up the chessboard, or maybe you do, I don't know. But you accept sometimes that, you know, you started out with the same number of pieces and just one party won. And so equality of opportunity is meant to give you that kind of a case. If you don't have that, then you have no guarantee that the game isn't just called Ryan wins and I always just win. And so if it is a game of Ryan wins, then there's a pretty good reason for you to be out with pitchforks or throw up the board, right? Whereas social cohesion doesn't have that kind of level of import. It's just whether it's easier for us to resolve our disputes because we share the same kinds of values. Does that help?
Yeah, just on that, in terms of equality of opportunity, it seems that in the real world, beyond formal equality of opportunity, there is not really much equality of opportunity, and yet people aren't getting their pitchforks out. It seems most people just accept it. So is it just enough that people believe they have the equality of opportunity without really having it, or that they just accept it? Is that enough?
Good. So I think this differs in different places. So the US is, even compared to Western counterparts, really low on the protest in the streets scale. At the same time, there's a lot of institutional support for equality of opportunity in the United States. Whether it ends up being fully sufficient is another question, but like we do have a public school system, we do have a public defender system, we have all kinds of convenient examples of people that have rags to riches stories, right? And we're quite convinced that this works. And so there might just be the kind of minimal threshold levels of equality of opportunity that's necessary to avoid the rioting in the street, but that might be a function of kind of the general attitudes and propensity to protest of a population. So again, with a France sort of example, they protest quite a bit over much smaller claims than one might protest about in the United States. And that's not because they're crazy people or anything. It's just there's kind of a different social allowance for differences in equality. The United States seems to be more okay with it because we're more interested in the meritocracy part than the equality part. So I think this is going to be kind of a social psychological fact about a particular population. But I take your point.
I was listening today, the fast food workers are mounting another push towards affecting the political outcome in elections, and with their $15 an hour thing. And it looks on the face of it like the equality of opportunity and a little bit of the social cohesion that they're putting it out there on social media and trying to garner support. And that, with those two things, it kind of runs a little contrary to what your conclusion was the best outcome. So what do you think?
Good. So yeah, so I agree that it's not politically impossible to choose that other option of equality of opportunity and social cohesion and abandoning meritocracy. I tend to think that it doesn't work very well as you scale up, but that's an empirical question. And the main reason that I think it doesn't work so well is that there are a lot of incentive problems. So if we have any sort of concern with kind of maximizing production, whether that production is artistic or economic or political or whatever it might be, we have some reason for adjusting resources around to make sure that we're giving those resources to people that can produce more. So there are plenty of people that are kind of political egalitarians or political communitarians that are going to think that's a totally viable option. So I don't think I think that first option just can't work. So if we just have meritocracy and social cohesion, I think that falls apart quite fast. This one I think is something that is endorsed in some areas of literature, and I think you're pointing to a movement that's endorsing it as well. I have my doubts on kind of the large-scale viability of that. But certainly people can be at least initially motivated by it. The question is, with that sort of system in place, what do we see the kind of incentive effects looking like? So one area that we might have some evidence is kibbutzes in Israel, the degree to which they kind of fall apart under egalitarian reward systems versus the degree to which they succeed. A lot of them over time end up adopting more and more meritocratic notions, just because it's kind of hard to work for everybody else and not yourself. It's not logically impossible. I just tend to think it's not being borne out by history as a successful solution. All right, thank you.